The sign went up on a Tuesday. Ruth Callahan watched the real estate agent hammer it into the ground at the end of the driveway from the kitchen window. It took less than 5 minutes. The agent waved on his way back to his car, and Ruth raised a hand in return, and then he was gone, and the sign was there, and the farm was officially for sale. She had known it was coming. She had been the one to make the call, schedule the appointment, sit across from the agent in her own living room, and go through the listing details with the patience and precision she brought to most things. She had not cried during that meeting. She had asked practical questions and received practical answers and signed where she was asked to sign. She was 68 years old. Her husband, Paul Callahan, had died 4 years earlier. A heart attack in November, fast and without warning, the kind that doesn't give a person time to prepare or say anything in particular. He had been 66. They had been married for 41 years. For 4 years she had managed. The crop ground was leased to a neighboring operation that handled it well and paid on time. She maintained the property herself, with occasional help from her son when he could get away from his own life in Des Moines. She had kept the house in good order. She had kept the equipment maintained, or had it maintained, because that was what Paul would have done, and because a machine left to sit becomes a problem. She had not planned to sell for another 2 or 3 years. But the winter had been long, and the isolation of a farmstead in January and February had settled into her in a way that it hadn't in previous years, and by March she had made the decision, and by April the sign was in the ground. The sale was straightforward. The land would transfer with the property. The house would close whenever the buyer was ready. The equipment, most of it, would be included in a separate negotiated package or sold at auction if that proved cleaner. Most of it. There was one machine she had not placed on any list. Paul Callahan had bought the Massey Ferguson in the spring of 1979. They had been married less than a year. Ruth had been 24. Paul had been 25, running the farm he had taken over from his father 2 years earlier at 23. Too young, most people thought. But Paul had been farming since he was 12, and the transition had been less dramatic than it might have been for someone with less time on equipment. The tractor was a Massey Ferguson 285. He had researched the purchase with the kind of thoroughness he applied to everything he decided, comparing specifications, talking to other farmers, spending time at the dealership asking questions that the salesman clearly was not used to being asked. Ruth had gone with him to the dealership twice. She remembered sitting in a plastic chair near the parts counter while Paul and the salesman stood beside the tractor and discussed something technical that she didn't follow and didn't try to. She had followed plenty of things over the 41 years that came after. She had learned to understand equipment in the practical way that farm wives learn, not to operate it herself particularly, but to know when something sounded wrong, to understand what a repair would cost and whether it was worth it, to recognize when Paul was worried about a machine and when he was simply thinking. She had developed, over decades, a kind of fluency in the language of the farm that she had not come to the marriage with. The 285 had been Paul's primary tractor for nearly 15 years. Then it had become secondary as the operation grew and newer equipment came in, but it had never left. Paul had kept it running, kept it useful, assigned it the lighter work and the odd jobs that a farm always generates. In the last decade of his life, it had been, if anything, more present than ever, because Paul was slowing down himself, taking on the tasks that didn't require the bigger equipment, and the 285 was sized right for a man who was 62 and didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. He had been driving it the week before he died. Ruth knew that because she had seen him from the kitchen window, moving along the fence row on the south side, doing something with the brush that had been encroaching on the fence posts. It had been a cold November morning, and she had thought about bringing him coffee and had decided to wait until he came in. He had come in at noon. They had eaten lunch. He had died that evening. She had not moved the tractor since. Not out of superstition or sentiment, exactly. She had used it once, the following spring, for something that needed doing and that she couldn't manage otherwise. but she had not assigned it the regular work. The leasing operation used their own equipment. The 285 sat in the machine shed, and she maintained it, and that was where things stood. Now she had 3 weeks before the closing process would require her to have accounted for every piece of equipment on the property. Her son Michael had driven down from Des Moines on the second Saturday after the sign went up. He was 40 years old, an engineer, married with 2 children who were growing up in a suburb and had limited experience with the farm their grandfather had run. Michael came back when he could and helped when he was there and understood, in the way that children of farmers understand things, the broad shape of what his parents' life had been. He did not understand the details, and he knew he didn't, and he was generally sensible enough not to pretend otherwise. He walked the property with Ruth that afternoon, going through the buildings and the equipment, making notes on a legal pad in the methodical way he approached things. He was helpful and practical, and she was glad he was there. When they came to the machine shed, and he walked around the 285 and made a note and asked if it was going with the equipment package or to auction, she told him she hadn't decided yet. He looked at her over the legal pad with the expression of a person who is trying to be careful. He said, "Mom, what's the decision?" She told him she didn't know yet. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that the tractor was worth something, and that including it in the package or putting it in the auction would make sense financially, and that he didn't want to see her leave money on the table when the rest of the sale was already structured the way it was. Ruth told him she understood. He asked if she was thinking of keeping it. She said she didn't know. Michael was a good son. He did not push further. He wrote something on the legal pad and moved on to the next building, and the subject was set aside for the afternoon. That evening, after he had driven back to Des Moines, Ruth sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and thought about the question he had asked. What was the decision? She had been asking herself the same thing for 6 weeks, since before the sign was in the ground, since the moment she had begun to understand seriously that the farm was going to sell and that she would need to have answered this question before it closed. She could not find a clean answer. Her nearest neighbor, nearest in the sense that mattered on a farm, which was less about distance than about history, was a woman named Lorraine Hess, who lived a mile and a half north and had been farming with her husband until he retired 5 years ago and handed the operation to their youngest. Lorraine was 72 and had known Ruth for 30 years and understood the Callahan farm in the way that long-term neighbors understand things, not intimately but accurately. She knew what kind of farmer Paul had been. She knew how Ruth had managed since he died. She had opinions, and she generally kept them to herself unless asked, which was one of the reasons Ruth trusted her. Ruth drove over on a Wednesday morning, which was when Lorraine was usually in and had time. They sat in Lorraine's kitchen and drank coffee, and Ruth explained the situation plainly, the sale, the timeline, the question about the tractor, and asked what Lorraine thought. Lorraine was quiet for a moment. She was not a woman who filled silence. Then she said, "What does keeping it mean, practically?" Ruth told her it meant the tractor would need to go somewhere. She had a daughter in Nebraska who had acreage, not a farming operation, but land, and who had said she could store it if Ruth needed, or Ruth herself might rent a storage unit for equipment, or she might look at what a long-term storage arrangement would cost. None of the options were impossible. None of them were simple. Lorraine asked, "And what does selling it mean?" Ruth said it meant she would not have to figure out any of those things. It meant the question was answered and behind her. Lorraine nodded. She said, "That's not actually what I'm asking." Ruth looked at her. Lorraine said, "I'm asking what selling it means to you, not logistically." Ruth was quiet for a moment. She said she wasn't sure she knew how to answer that. Lorraine said she didn't have to answer it to her. She just needed to know whether she had asked herself the question directly or whether she was trying to make it a logistical problem because that was easier. Ruth drove home thinking about that. She spent several days being honest with herself in the way that the question required. She was not by nature a sentimental person. She had not kept Paul's truck after he died. She had not preserved his clothes beyond what she had passed to Michael. She had cleared out his shop in the barn within the first year, not coldly, but practically, because a shop full of someone else's projects is just a room that doesn't function anymore. She had made the decisions that needed making and had not apologized for them. She had kept the tractor. She had told herself for 4 years that she had kept it because it was functional and because the lease operation didn't require her to remove it and because there was no pressing reason to deal with it. All of those things were true. None of them were the real reason. The real reason, which she had been aware of and had not examined directly, was that the tractor was the last thing on the property that was still his, in a way that was specific and unambiguous. The house held his absence. Every room had places where he wasn't anymore. But the house was not his the way the tractor was his. The furniture was theirs, the house was theirs, the farm was theirs. The 285 was Paul's. It had been Paul's from the year before she had known him well enough to know what he was, and he had driven it for 40 years. And the week before he died, he had been on it, moving along a fence row in the cold November light. She understood, when she finally sat with this directly, what the tractor was to her. It was not a memorial, and it was not a shrine. She was not confused about that. It was simply the most concrete remaining evidence that the 41 years had been real, that the farm, the marriage, the life they had built in this particular piece of ground had actually happened and had not simply dissolved when he died. She also understood, when she was being completely honest, that she was selling the farm, she was selling the ground and the buildings and the house. She was leaving. She had decided to leave, had decided it was the right time, had arranged for it to happen. She was choosing to close this chapter in the practical, deliberate way she made most choices. And if she was leaving, she needed to understand what leaving meant. Michael called on a Thursday evening, 10 days before the closing deadline on the equipment inventory. He asked, carefully, if she had made a decision about the tractor. She told him she was still thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the tone of a person who has prepared what he's going to say, "Mom, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it as coming from a place of caring and not from a place of telling you what to do." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "I think keeping the tractor is a way of not finishing what you've started. I think you've made a brave decision to sell the farm and move forward, and I think holding on to this one piece of equipment is a way of leaving a door open that you've already decided to close. And I think that's going to make things harder for you, not easier, in the long run." Ruth listened to this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "That's a reasonable thing to think." He said, "But." She said, "I haven't said but yet." He said, "I know you well enough to know there's a but." She said, "I've been selling things and giving things away and moving things along for 4 years. I have not held on to things. I have done what needed to be done. I am selling the farm. I know what I'm doing and why I'm doing it. What I don't know yet is whether the right thing to do at the end of all of it is to let go of the last thing or to keep it." Michael was quiet. She said, "Those aren't the same decision. Selling the farm is the right decision. What I do with the tractor is a separate question, and it deserves to be treated separately." He said he understood. She said she appreciated him calling. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the kitchen. The sign at the end of the driveway was visible from where she sat if she turned slightly. The machine shed was not visible from the kitchen. It was behind the barn, set back from the house. But she knew exactly where it was and what was in it. She thought about what Michael had said. She thought about what Lorraine had asked her. She thought about what she had eventually told herself, honestly, about what the tractor meant. And then she thought about something else, something she had not brought into the conversation yet because she hadn't been sure how to think about it. What she had been avoiding, she realized, was the simplest version of the question. Not, what does the tractor mean? Not, what will keeping it cost? Not, what would Paul want? The simplest version was this. In 10 years, when she was 78, whatever her life looked like by then, wherever she lived, whatever shape things were in, would she be glad she had kept it, or would she be glad she had let it go? She sat with that for a long time. She thought about her daughter in Nebraska, who had offered storage and who meant it sincerely. She thought about what it would mean to have the tractor on her daughter's property, present, maintained there. She thought about what it would mean to visit it, whether she would visit it. She thought about a man she had been married to for 41 years, and what he had been like, and what he had valued. He had not been a person who kept things out of sentiment. He had been a person who kept things because they worked and sold them when they stopped working. He had been unsentimental about equipment in the way that good farmers are, not because equipment doesn't matter, but because sentiment clouds the decisions that machinery requires. He would not have kept a tractor because of what it meant. He would have kept it if it was useful and sold it if it wasn't. She understood, finally, what the actual question was. The question was not what the tractor meant to her. She knew what it meant to her. The question was whether meaning was a sufficient reason to hold on to a machine. She thought it probably wasn't. She thought Paul would have agreed with that, and would have said so directly, in the way he said most things. She thought about the neighboring farmer, a man named Ed Gruber, who ran a smaller operation 2 miles east, and who had mentioned, the previous summer, that he was looking for a reliable older tractor for lighter work, groundwork, fence lines, the kind of tasks that a smaller machine handles better. He was a careful farmer and a sensible man, and he had known Paul, had respected him, and would understand what he was being offered. She picked up the phone. The equipment inventory was finalized with 8 days to spare. The Massey Ferguson 285 was not on the auction list and was not included in the equipment package that went with the property sale. It was sold privately to Ed Gruber at a price that was fair and agreed upon without difficulty. Ed had come to pick it up on a Saturday morning with a flatbed and a hand he used for that kind of work. Ruth had met them in the machine shed and unlocked the door and stood to one side while they made the preparations to load it. Ed had looked the tractor over carefully in the way that a serious farmer looks at equipment he's buying, not suspicious, just thorough, and had nodded once in a way that communicated what he thought of its condition. Before they loaded it, he had turned to Ruth and said, "This was Paul's tractor, wasn't it? The one he had from early on?" She said yes, from 1979. Ed nodded again. He said, "It'll get used right." She believed him. She watched them pull out of the driveway and stood in the machine shed doorway for a moment after they were gone. The shed was quiet, and the space where the tractor had been was just a rectangle of concrete floor now, with the particular cleanliness that comes from a spot that has been occupied for a long time. She closed the shed door and walked back to the house. Michael had called that evening, asking how the day had gone. She told him she had sold the tractor to Ed Gruber. He said he was glad. She said she was too. He asked if it had been hard. She said yes and no. It was the right thing. He said he was proud of her. She told him not to be dramatic, and he laughed and she smiled, and that was more or less the end of it. The farm closed 6 weeks later on a clear morning in June. Ruth signed the papers at the title company's office in town, accepted the handshake of the buying party's attorney, and drove back to the farmhouse for the last time to pick up the final boxes she had left packed in the front room. She stood in the kitchen one more time, the kitchen where she had made 30 years of lunches and watched Paul come in from the field and raise 2 children through the ordinary turbulence of growing up, and sat alone for 4 winters since he died. She stood in it for a few minutes. She did not say anything. There was nothing in particular to say. Then she picked up her keys and her purse and walked out to her car and drove down the driveway past the real estate sign, which the agent would collect later in the week. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She had never been in the habit of it. Somewhere 2 miles east, in a machine shed that was not the one she had just left, a Massey Ferguson 285 that had been purchased in the spring of 1979 was getting its first week of use on a new farm. The man running it was careful with equipment and knew what he had and would not waste it. Ruth knew that. It was enough.